I remember hearing people say, shame on you, or shame on them. And it was just like the way that people did it because they thought that was okay. And what this ends up looking like now, though, is when we're playing the shame game, we're doing things like, I'll be good enough when, or I can rest when, or I'll be good enough if in some cases, right? And never quite feeling good enough. It can also look like perfectionism, which is a whole nother piece. And we'll talk about perfectionism because there's a lot to unpack there. Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to talk about the most damaging way we get ourselves to do stuff with ADHD. We've all learned many ways to deal with having ADHD, to get ourselves to function in this world that wasn't designed for us. And certainly, maybe we wouldn't have to figure out all these tricks if things were different, but they're not. And so I want to talk about how to get ourselves to do stuff. But first, as part of that, I want to make sure that we're shifting away from doing this one because it's damaging. We've figured out lots of ways, like I said. We've tried procrastination, anxiety. That was my big one. Anxiety was the way I'd get myself to do stuff. I actually was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, but it was secondary to my ADHD. Right? Procrastination, we use to get stuff done because the fight or flight response, right? The, oh my gosh, I got to get it done now, kicks in and motivates us to be able to do it. So that's why that can work, at least in the short term, but they all take their toll. But I would say none of them take their toll quite as much as this one that's super damaging. What is it? It's shame. When we play the shame game, we are creating layers and layers of additional damage, right? Additional pain that someday we're going to have to sort through. And hopefully that someday can be now, right? If you've been doing this. And to be fair, first of all, growing up in the 70s and 80s, shame was like the go-to way to parent, right? Or to treat kids in schools, right? Like I remember hearing people say, shame on you or shame on them. And it was just like the way that people did it because they thought that was okay. And what this ends up looking like now, though, is when we're playing the shame game, we're doing things like, I'll be good enough when, or I can rest when, or I'll be good enough if in some cases, right? And never quite feeling good enough. It can also look like perfectionism, which is a whole nother piece. And we'll talk about perfectionism because there's a lot to unpack there. So let's unpack what shame is first, and then we'll talk about what to do about it. Brene Brown has done a lot of research on shame. So I'm really drawing from her research here and some of the things she's written, as well as things that I've learned throughout my practice and experience in the world, as well as being a mental health professional for over 23 years now. Anyway, so the difference between shame and guilt is I did something wrong, or I did something that wasn't okay, or I did something that wasn't right, or whatever words you want to use there. Shame is I am wrong, or I am bad. So the first one, guilt, is identifying like, oh yeah, there's a problem here in how I showed up and that needs to be addressed. Whereas shame is making it about your character. So that when you make a mistake, you become bad, which being humans, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. I don't even necessarily like the word mistake anymore because I think a lot of times it's just learning, right? Like we're just kind of, I don't know about you, but I think most humans, at least from what I see in my practice, most of us are just bumbling around in this world trying to figure out stuff. And the people that look like they have it all together from the outside are doing the same thing. They just have a better staged performance than some others do. We're not seeing their backstage messiness, right? Or the consequences of doing whatever kind of masking they're doing. I'm not saying there aren't people who are doing, maybe, I hate the word better, but aren't perhaps navigating this world with greater ease. Those people are probably people who this world was designed for. Definitely not women, definitely not people of color, definitely not gay or trans folks, or anyone who's not a white male with a certain body size and a certain amount of money. So for a lot of us in the world, we do bump into things that don't work out the way we intended. And we might feel like we failed or made a mistake. And the reality is, you can use that language, but in truth, being human is hard. We're navigating this world, especially if you're navigating the world, as I said, not one of those people it's designed for. And so it is going to be a little bumpy as we figure out, like, okay, how do I get myself to function in this system? How do I get myself to function in this one? And it's not all about functioning. I want to be clear. Like, you still have value as a human, even if you're not functioning optimally, right? Like, you still are a good person who has meaning and value. And for most of us, we need to find ways to function in the world so we can support ourselves and eat, stuff like that, right? So when I talk about functioning, that's what I'm talking about, is getting ourselves to be productive enough to be able to enjoy life. And so a big shift that we can make is, instead of shaming the crap out of ourselves, is to start to see that whatever we're coming up against, whatever shows up that didn't work out the way you intended, or if you say something that wasn't fantastic. I just heard in my head, if you say something stupid, which is like shaming, right? Like, that's not helpful. Those patterns are deep, but it's to recognize that, oh, we can learn from that, right? And like I've talked about in other episodes, we have to have the self-awareness to be able to notice, like, oh, okay, that wasn't really productive. And I'm not going to unpack all that in this episode. You can watch episode 10. I go a little more into mindfulness for sure. There's a couple other ones too. But as we have mindful awareness, we can say, oh yeah, what didn't go so well here? What could I shift instead of, nope, I'm bad? Because when we jump to I'm bad, think about what that does. I want to talk a little bit about the growth mindset more, and I'll come back to that. But when you think you're bad, think about what that does. Does it actually make you function better? I'm going to go with no. And I want to share some of Carol Dweck's work in the book Mindset, which I got to tell you, like, fantastic research. It's not the most like enticing read. So no offense to her, but if you're going to read a book, I've got a longer list of books to recommend. But she talks about the growth versus fixed mindset. And what she talks about with the fixed mindset, which is, how a lot of us in this generation, these generations were raised. It's, you either have it or you don't. And if you make a mistake, it means you don't have it. And that you're potentially, then that can transfer into you're bad, or you should be ashamed. And while that might work for a while, it actually gets in the way of us being able to do as well as we could do, because it shuts off all learning. An example that Carol uses in her book about this is John McEnroe. So for those of you who are, I don't know, under 40, you might not have heard of John McEnroe. He was a tennis player. I remember him in the 80s. It could have been as early as the 70s. I'm not sure. I was pretty young still in the 70s. But he, just for those of you for reference, he had that afro hair. He was a white guy with afro curly hair and like a headband, and the hair popped up on top. And anytime he missed a point or something didn't go his way in the game, he would get enraged. Like, he would have a full-on adult tantrum, maybe not even adult tantrum. Some of them were very like childlike tantrums on the tennis court. He would throw his racket, sometimes breaking it, blaming the racket. He would blame the court. He would blame the crowd, the wind, the ref. He would even like yell and scream at the refs, which doesn't seem appropriate. And so it's like, oh my gosh. And because he did that, he never looked at, what could I do differently in that last play to improve my game? So you see, he couldn't believe he was bad. He had to believe that he was this amazing tennis player, which meant then he couldn't make a mistake. He couldn't see his mistakes. He's since read her book and been like, yep, she's right. I would have been so much more of an amazing tennis player had I embraced that growth mindset of like, oh, okay, that point didn't go well. What can I learn from that? What can I learn about my opponent? How is the wind today? What do I want to do with the crowd? Whatever things tennis players think about. I am not a tennis player, which is probably very obvious for listening to me talk about that. That isn't effective. And I don't know if John McEnroe felt shame. She didn't necessarily talk about it, but that's the trap a lot of us get into is feeling shame when we're not able to do stuff. And all that does is keep us stuck. It keeps us from learning and growing. And in a lot of cases, it keeps us from acting, right? Because when we feel ashamed of ourselves, I think most of us just want to put the blanket over our head and cocoon ourselves and not really connect with the world because we feel like we're such a bad person. Why would we want anyone to see that or be around us? Which, first of all, feels like crap. So I certainly don't want you to feel that way, which is why we're talking about this. And also, you're not going to be able to get yourself to do the things that you want to do if you're feeling like that. Instead, we want to help ourselves shift to the growth mindset. And there's a lot of different pieces about this, but first I want to talk a little bit more about the growth mindset. I've been alluding to it more specifically. It's recognizing that we can do just about anything with the right effort and the right amount of effort. And I read her book and I was like, could someone with a major cognitive disability be a doctor? And, I don't know that she's talking about that. Maybe they could. Maybe they just have to learn a different way to take in material or something like that. I'm just thinking of the intensity of med school and wondering how that would go if you had cognitive deficits. Essentially, the idea is that most of us can do just about anything that we want to if we put our mind to it, if we put our energy behind it, and if we can stick with the growth mindset where we're like, okay, well, that didn't work. I'm going to learn another way to do that, right? Versus shaming ourselves or blaming others when things don't work out the way we intended. So those are the basic cognitive concepts. And for a lot of us, this goes so much deeper than just thinking about it because we have had the messages that were bad growing up, that our ADHD is bad, that we just need to pay attention, or you can pay attention here, but why can't you pay attention there? Or sit still, or look at me when I'm talking at you. They never said at you, but that's what it was. Right? So we've gotten all these messages. Also, get your shit together. That's one that definitely happened. Maybe the swearing didn't happen when we were kids. Maybe it did, but pull it together. That's one. So I get it. We come by this honestly. And just thinking about shifting to the growth mindset probably isn't going to be enough because as I've talked about in other episodes, shaming, that telling us we aren't good enough over and over, the criticism, the character attacks, that takes its toll and is traumatic for many. And as I talked about in that other episode, trauma gets stuck in the body. So just thinking and talking about it isn't going to be enough to loosen it up. So my two favorite strategies for dealing with this or working with this are IFS, which is working with the parts of us, and then trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga. I like those because they are more gentle approaches. I'm also EMDR certified, but I find that can be pretty intense for most people, especially if you've had that daily kind of trauma. No offense to EMDR. It's a fantastic protocol. And we can do some of this IFS work on our own. Maybe not with the really big, heavy stuff. Like I'm not suggesting you do this if you have really heavy abuse history or, rape or stuff like that. The things that if you told someone about it, they go, oh my God, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you. That's horrible. Or they'd look at you and be like, huh? I work with clients who have complex trauma. And a lot of times when they tell people their story, people's brains are so overloaded by the fact that someone experienced that as a kid, they don't even have a reaction to it. They're just like, weird. But if you're in that boat, certainly I recommend that you work with a therapist. It's super, super important. And if the trauma you experience is mostly the criticism of ADHD, some other smaller things that still your brain doesn't know the difference. So our brains and our bodies see trauma as trauma. So that's something to keep in mind. That constant criticism can feel just as big inside of our bodies as being hit as a kid because our nervous system is just primed to look for danger and keep us safe. It's not like, oh, is this a tiger or a nasty comment? How upset or scared should I be? Right? Our nervous system is just like danger, 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 get away. So it's important to really honor where you're at. And some of the things that we can do on our own or try on our own is working with the parts of us that feel this way. And what that can look like is when you catch yourself saying, oh, I'm an idiot, which is shame, right? Because you're calling yourself something bad. Or, oh, I'm such a dumbass. That's when I hear clients say, or I'm the worst. I've heard clients lately say, I'm the worst about themselves. If they said it about me, I'd be interested in what what's going on there and what I can do to change, but they're saying it about themselves. And so to me, then it's about noticing like, hey, there's a part of me that thinks I'm the worst, or there's a part of me that thinks I'm bad. Wow. And instead of being like, no, I'm good. I'm going to push that down. I'm going to do the growth mindset. That doesn't really work. Because it's like, holding a beach ball underwater. If you've ever tried to do that, you can do it for a while, but it takes a lot of effort. And eventually that beach ball is going to breach the surface, usually in the form of a big water explosion, which is what tends to happen when we push away our feelings and the parts of us that have something to say. So if instead, when you're noticing those shame thoughts, you can say to yourself like, oh, yeah, there's a part of me that feels like I'm bad. I wonder what that's about. And just even unpack it for a little bit, get curious. I find writing can really help with that, to write out what some of the parts are saying. It gives them a space. You can also do this finding some silence if you're able to create space for that in your life and reflecting on it. But it's important that you find a way to tune in and listen, even if just for a moment, and say, oh, where's that coming from? Or whose voice is this? And identifying that, oh, you know what? That's an old story. The thing is, your parts oftentimes, because trauma's stuck in the body, they're stuck in the past. They don't know that you're not a little girl anymore. They don't know that you're not being scolded by your teacher or parent. I mean, you might be being scolded by a teacher or parent, but you're a grown up now. Hopefully not. If you are, we should talk about boundaries. But your younger parts don't get that. They're not time oriented. And so some of this can be saying like, hey, that's an old story. Now I'm 49 years old and it's 2023 or whatever year it is when you're listening to this. And so I get why you're scared, but like those people aren't around us or we don't let them talk to us that way. And if that's not true, certainly don't say that, but then that's something to work on, right? If you're still having people in your life shame you, there are some boundary things that we can work on around that. So much of this is getting curious about our shame experiences and especially talking about them with someone. You can talk with a therapist, you could talk with a friend or beloved partner. I would recommend talking with someone who is emotionally safe enough. They don't have to be perfect, but that they're going to be able to hear you and not be like, well, you kind of are bad. I mean, like that would be like worst case scenario. Because as Brene Brown says, shame loves secrecy. So even by you naming it and identifying the parts of you that feel shame, that's going to help. Another thing we can do is to say it to someone else. Hey, I'm feeling shame right now. And this is what it is. Or I'm feeling like I'm a bad person, right? Because remember, shame isn't I did something that I need to fix. Like I made a mistake and I need to make it right. Or I need to learn something and do something differently because it didn't work. Shame is I'm bad. It's the belief that you're bad or not good enough because you did something that didn't work out. It's jumping to a character assassination, essentially, because something didn't work for you. And that's not productive. All it does is keep you stuck. I want to circle back and talk a little bit about perfectionism because that's something that can come up here. It's a sneaky way that shame shows up. I think a lot of us women with ADHD tend to struggle with perfectionism, Why? Well, I have a theory, or I guess it's a hypothesis technically because I haven't tested it. But my hypothesis is that we spend so much time getting criticized that we try to find ways to avoid that criticism. And in doing so, we work our butts off trying to be perfect so no one could possibly criticize us. Am I right? I don't know. I'd love to hear you what you have to say about that in the comments and see if that resonates for anyone. But oftentimes, to avoid criticism, to avoid people telling us we're bad, we strive for perfectionism. And so we come by it honestly, but the problem is there is no such thing as perfectionism unless you like redefine it. But that ideal state where everything is perfect, that's just not ever possible. I mean, yeah, okay, you might tap dancing came into my head because I tap dance, and we did a show this last May and I did one of the dances in it. There's a grown-up tap group. It's pretty chill, but it was super fun. And I didn't really make any mistakes in it. There was something I bobbled a little bit, but I didn't make mistakes. I was like, oh my gosh, that was amazing and perfect. But that's not useful because, it's like, okay, yeah, I nailed it that one time, but that's really hard to maintain. So I'm not saying it can never happen that, a 3-minute tap dance can't be close to perfected or whatever. But I'm sure if we have any performers here, singers, artists, especially artists, I hear that they're their worst critic when they look at their art. Even if we're like, wow, that's amazing, it's so beautiful and perfect, they're like, oh no, it's shit. It's total crap. So a lot of times we have to step away from that definition of perfect, that it has to be this some amazing ideal, and instead recognize that we can do the best we can do in any given moment and we can keep learning. Because when we strive for perfectionism to avoid other people's criticism, we tend to exhaust the heck out of ourselves. And then we can get perfectionistic and critical about other people because why aren't they working this hard to be perfect and to get everything right? So then we can get resentful, like nobody cares as much as I care. And sometimes it's true that no one cares as much as you do. Oftentimes it just feels that way. The truth of the matter is people just have different values or different ways of functioning in the world. And if you've learned to strive for perfectionism, working extra hard and pushing yourself until everything is just right so no one could possibly criticize you, I might suggest that's not the healthiest approach. It may have worked for you. So if you have parts in you going, yes, it is, it's the best way to do it, I want to validate those parts. Like it has gotten you to this point. And long term, that takes its toll. It's exhausting, negatively impacts relationships. And really, it has its roots in shame, which we've already talked about, eventually burns us out so much that we just want to hide under a blanket and hide. Working with perfectionism is similar to how we work with the shame, right? We notice the part of us that's like, oh yeah, you have to keep going because it's not perfect yet. And notice that and get curious about it. See where that story comes from and work with that. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I would love if you would put in the comments what you found especially useful. So today we covered the most dangerous way we get ourselves to do stuff, which is shame. And a piece of that is perfectionism and that fixed mindset. So I encourage you to start to notice your patterns, notice how you're getting yourself to do stuff. And remember that shame might work in the short term, but long term, it's going to take its toll. And so see if you can try some of the strategies we talked about today to be able to do something different. All right. Make sure you follow if you're not already. Take care.